All right. Hi there, Epidemics. Hope everybody's doing well today. I kind of glitched on the pre-Zoom game this morning. Sorry about that. You were supposed to see just the left-hand panel and figure out which one was the moon and which ones were not. Obviously, this one on the lower left is the moon, and the others are just carefully photographed images that look similar to a moon. All right, so I'm going to have some assignments that I'm going to post toward the end of this week, either Friday or Saturday. These assignments are not going to be due until March 24th, and that is because spring break is next week. So giving you, the week off, and then you come back and you finish up these assignments, or you do the assignments over spring break if you prefer. But next week, spring break. Okay, we've been talking about 1918 and the massive flu pandemic that took place in 1918. So I want to give you some brief highlights of what life was like in 1918 in America. This is my grandmother. She was alive for the 1918 flu pandemic, and she knew people who died from it. In 1918, indoor plumbing was rare. Most people still used outhouses. Half of all families lived and worked on farms. So this was a time period when farming was a major occupation. It was not the way it is today, where it's very industrialized. Of course, the population was a lot smaller at that time, which kind of the size of our population now, if we didn't have industrial farming, we couldn't manage to feed ourselves. Half of all children in 1918 lived in poverty. This was before the Great Depression. So the Great Depression started another decade later. And at this point, half of all children lived in poverty. Most did not attend high school. The majority of boys started work at age 14. So things have changed a little bit since then, mostly for the better. At least the indoor plumbing is better. We think that the 1918 flu pandemic began in Haskell County in Kansas. So that's where the arrow is pointing to. Here's Kansas right here. A doctor, Dr. Loring Miner, started noticing cases of influenza that were more severe than what he had seen for the previous several years. And surprisingly, the target population was really healthy young men. Usually with flu epidemics, the very, very young, the very old, and the otherwise unhealthy for whatever reason, those tend to be impacted more. But in the 1918 pandemic, it was healthy young adults, which is usually one of the lowest risk groups for severe infections and illnesses. Dr. Miner tried to contact public health officials. They didn't respond, but he did publish his work. He did publish this new wave of flu infections in a scientific journal, which is how we know that the epidemic started in Kansas. These cases kind of burned out in a couple of months. So it lasted for a couple of months. And then, not so much anymore. There were not enough immunologically naive people to keep the epidemic going, meaning it moved through the community and everybody then had immunity to it. And there wasn't as much travel and there wasn't as much of a population density as we have nowadays. So it seemed to burn out. And very often, this used to be a very normal course for a pandemic or an outbreak of a new or more infectious disease. It would burn through a community and then, nobody interacted with each other. There wasn't a lot of travel, so it would just kind of die out. Unfortunately, World War I was raging. And so several soldiers traveled from Haskell County to Camp Funston, which is marked with the circle here, also in Kansas. And it seems like they took the flu with them. So World War I was going on. The US was sending troops to Europe to help support their allies. And conditions at these army camps were not that great. The barracks were often overcrowded. They didn't have enough housing for people. Many of the soldiers were ending up sleeping in tents, even during the wintertime. And Kansas in the wintertime, not as bad as Massachusetts, but it's not pleasant at all. It does get really cold there. There wasn't enough clothing. There wasn't enough warm bedding for these people. And there were wartime shortages. Malnutrition was widespread. In fact, during this time period, about a quarter of all children died before the age of 5. 1 out of every 4. A lot of it was because of malnutrition. People were living under high stress because of the war. And stress inhibits the immune system. So when you're stressed, you're more susceptible to infection. Okay, this is not sounding good, is it? There was also a lot of movement of troops. Troops were moving from army base to army base or to National Guard bases, back and forth, going to Europe, coming back from Europe, and they started taking the flu with them. On March 4th, 1918, a cook at Camp Funston reported that they had the flu. They were sick. Within 3 weeks, over 1,000 soldiers were in the hospital from flu. It spread really, really quickly. Only 38 of them died. The flu virus at this point was already showing signs of being able to spread faster and cause more severe illnesses than previous flus, but it wasn't as deadly as it was going to get. By March 18th, the flu had spread from Kansas to 2 different military bases down here in Georgia. And those 2 bases in Georgia had about 10% of the troops there ended up hospitalized. That's a really high percentage, especially when we're talking about young, relatively healthy men. By April, the flu was in Europe, in France specifically. So, how bad was it? The 1918 flu pandemic is definitely in the top 10. I think last time I looked, it's still in the top 5 for mortality rate on a per capita basis. Per capita means that we're comparing the number of people who died to the population size at that time. Obviously, the population of the planet in 1918 was a lot smaller than it is now. So having that per capita number gives you a better feel for just how bad things were, rather than seeing a total death toll. Although the total death toll is really big, and it's one of the biggies. So the death toll, we don't have accurate numbers. We're going to see this over and over this semester. We don't have accurate numbers for any epidemic. We don't even have accurate numbers for the COVID pandemic right now. But we know that between 50 and 100 million people died during the 1918 flu. This was around 2 to 3% of the world population. So COVID in the US has killed 1 out of every 300 Americans, which I think is horrific. Now imagine that it's 1 out of every 50 to 1 out of every 30. It's a lot more severe. We see different fatality rates in different regions, probably because they were slightly different strains of the flu, the conditions people were living in that might make them more vulnerable or more resistant to infection. Some cities were completely wiped out. Pretty much most of the city would be impacted by the flu, and the survivors would flee. Half of these deaths were in people between 20 and 40 years old, which is really, really unusual. I've said this before, we see it with COVID. Most of the people who succumb to infections are less than 2 or over about 55 or 60. This is a very unusual range. We saw during the course of this pandemic that 30% of the world population got infected during this pandemic and got sick with the flu. We see this kind of rate with COVID. Certainly, a very large percentage of the world population has been infected with COVID. Unfortunately, with COVID, that doesn't give you immunity to reinfection. It gives you some resistance to the severity of reinfection, but you can still get it again. With the flu, once you got the 1918 flu, if you survived it, you weren't going to get it again. Now, I mentioned that it appeared to have started in Kansas. When we look at the history, the earliest reports that we see were from Kansas. And we can track the route of transmission from this county in Kansas to the military base, where we saw early infections, from that base to other bases. Having this clear route of transmission makes it the most likely origin for this particular strain of virus. The virus got more severe as time progressed. We like to think that infections, the pathogens get milder with time, but that is not always the case. There's a second hypothesis that suggested France, because it showed up there pretty early, but the fact that we can track the French cases back to military bases in the US, which can track back to military bases in Kansas, makes Kansas more likely. Both of these locations have people, pigs, and waterfowl in close association. Farming with livestock. We're going to see why having pigs and people and ducks in the same area can be a problem with flu. Now, despite the fact that it was pretty obvious it came from the US, it was pretty obvious the first place in Europe that got it was France, a lot of countries started calling it the Spanish flu. Why? If it clearly came from other places, why was it called the Spanish flu? Well, during World War I, Spain was neutral. They weren't involved in the war. Countries that were involved in the war, England, France, Germany, and the US, were all censoring their news. So they were trying to encourage popular support for the war and not make their own countries look problematic for whatever reason, weak or bad or disease prone. In fact, in 1918, there was an act called the Sedition Act that was passed into law that prohibited, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the US government, its flag, or its armed forces, or that caused others to view the American government or its institutions with contempt. So during World War I, you were not allowed to say bad things about America, even though the First Amendment to the Constitution says you can. You know, that's the way countries work during war. They don't always follow their own rules. So you can see here some advertisings, this one on the left from the Virginia State Board of Health, talking about how to reduce the risk of spreading influenza and these other really nasty and at the time very, very deadly diseases. And then this one specifically mentions Spanish influenza as a menace to war production. So I've mentioned that the flu was infecting mostly young adults. This is a flu ward. You can see that this was probably a theater that was converted into a ward for people who were sick with the flu. There were not enough hospital beds. Like we saw early in the COVID pandemic, you just put people where you can put them. Why was this strain impacting young adults? It's not really clear, but there are two hypotheses, two ideas about what was going on. One was that the elderly, who generally have a weaker immune system, had been exposed in the past to a flu strain that was what we call antigenically similar. What does this mean? Well, an antigen is anything that stimulates the immune response. And when we talked about the immune system a couple of weeks back, remember that the immune system has a memory. So the idea was that older people had a memory of a flu strain that was similar enough to the 1918 strain that they had some immune resistance. They had some protection from this disease. Okay, that doesn't explain why young children weren't dying of it. The other estimate The other hypothesis that is because young adults have a very strong immune system. Okay, this is good, right? Having a very healthy, very strong immune response, that's good, right? The problem is if you are fighting off a particularly nasty pathogen, your immune system can cause a lot of harm to your body. So the immune response itself can be harmful to your body. We sometimes see this referred to things like cytokine storms, where the immune system just goes so bonkers, it just screws up all kinds of things in the body. We get uncontrollable fevers. We get leaky blood vessels. We want, when you're sick, your blood vessels kind of get a little bit leaky so that your immune cells can get out of the bloodstream to where the infection is. But if that goes too far, you're losing blood volume, you're losing important nutrients. And that can be really particularly deadly. With the 1918 strain, fatality was usually within 24 to 48 hours. My grandmother went to a funeral of one of her high school classmates. The classmate, the boy whose funeral she went to, had gone to a dance 2 days before, perfectly healthy. He passed away from the flu. And while she was at his funeral, she looked over and saw a funeral for the guy's date to the dance. So 2 people perfectly healthy within 48 hours there were funerals going. So really quickly deadly. Flu cases generally nowadays, not the 1918 strain, last 1 to 2 weeks, and most fatalities happen at the end. So usually later on in the progression of the illness. All right. So we've got all of this stuff going on. We've got these ideas about what was going on. We've got estimates of rates of infection and the mortality rate. With the 1918 flu, with COVID, in fact, with a lot of different pandemics, we think that the estimates of mortality are often underestimates. Even in modern times, we think that modern medicine underestimates diseases. This can be because of misdiagnoses. Somebody put the wrong thing on the death certificate, which can be very, very common when it's a complicated system or a complicated situation. A lot of people who write the death certificates are the county coroner, who's not necessarily a medical doctor. So they're kind of coming up with their best guess about what happened. There are only a few diseases that have to be reported to the government. In the US, doctors and coroners have to report certain diseases to the Centers for Disease Control. There aren't that many that have to be reported. So we think a lot have not been reported. And if we look worldwide, the US is unusual in putting out death certificates for almost everyone who dies. A lot of countries don't issue death certificates. They just don't. So we don't have that information. Regardless of the accurate number of how many died, we can see a blip on the life expectancy graph. So this is a graph, goes from 1830 to 2019, so the year before COVID started, and it gives us the life expectancy. So when we talk about life expectancy, what do we mean? Somebody want to chime in?
Like the estimated kind of like span of how it's like how we predict how long someone's gonna live, kind of, right? Like if you have good lifestyle habits, this person will live to be 80, but the other person who doesn't have good lifestyle habits is only gonna live to be like 70.
Okay.
Kind of.
Thank you for that, because that is how most people perceive life expectancy. It's not exactly correct, though. So yes, that's the common understanding of life expectancy, but life expectancy is the average age at death for a population. Okay, nowadays we go, well, how is that different from saying how old we expect people to live? Because nowadays we don't have high or as high childhood mortality as we used to in the past. So it's a little bit closer to an estimate of how long you can expect to live. But when we talk about the past and we talk about life expectancy, what that means is you're taking the age at death for everyone who died in a given year. And getting the average. Which means that if you have a lot of people dying very young, that life expectancy will come down. If we look here, here is Finland in probably 1840. Life expectancy looks like 35. What was probably going on is that there was high infant mortality and relatively high childhood mortality. So a lot of people died when they were young. But if you made it to age 18 or 20, chances are you would live to be 70 or older. So the maximum life expectancy has not changed much over time. It's just that we have fewer people dying young, and that's why the life expectancy has gone up. People during the Middle Ages did not routinely die at age 30, even if life expectancy was 30. It was that most of them died before 15, with a big burst of deaths, or a big surge in death of women during their first childbirth. If people got through those stages, then their life expectancy from that point was pretty much what we see today. Very, very similar. Okay. So to give you an example, we've got twins born on the same day. One dies in the first year. The other lives to 70. Their life expectancy for these two individuals would be 35. I don't like the phrase life expectancy because that's not a very good way to describe it. But in this chart, I want to point out a couple of things right here. This dip, that is the 1918 flu pandemic right there. It shows up on the graphs for all of these countries that I pulled up: Switzerland, Spain, Sweden, Norway, Finland. I don't know why these particular countries were the ones I picked up for this graph, but it was certainly true throughout the world, including the United States. That was our 1918 pandemic. We've got another little dip here in a couple of countries. That looks like there was another flu pandemic right about here as well. The last thing I want to point out is here at 2019, the United States is this bottom line. These are well, it's Spain and the Scandinavian countries. Starting, here in the mid 80s, the US life expectancy has not gone up as much as most wealthy countries. Okay, so when we look at the 1918 pandemic, there were multiple waves of the pandemic. So the pandemic, the flu came through and then it faded, and then it came through again and it faded again. And this map shows the month during 1918 when the first flu cases were shown or showed up. So you can see the US was early, Canada, Mexico coming in shortly thereafter, then France, spreading across Europe to India, to Scandinavia up here. Japan got it really early, which is kind of interesting. South America got it much later. The areas where it's gray, we just don't have good data for. So the first wave was really in March and April. So most of the areas shown on this map got the first wave in March. March through August. So this is all the first wave. During March and through August in 1918, over 10% of British troops stationed in France were so sick they couldn't work. March, April, May, June, July, for 5 months, 10% of the British troops in France were too sick. Not each individual was sick for 5 months, but there was always 10% of the troops who were too sick. The second wave started in mid-September, so we had a little bit of a break. And it started at Camp Devens, which was located outside of Boston. In this wave, we had 20% of troops who were too sick to fulfill their duties. They got not just the typical symptoms, not just aches and chills and fever, but these individuals would get so sick, they weren't getting enough oxygen in their blood. And their skin, especially under the fingernails, would turn blue. This is called cyanosis. Cyan is a color of blue. So blue lips, blue fingernails. Patients would bleed from their mucous membranes. So that would be bleeding from the eyes, the nose, in the mouth, the ears, the anus, the vagina. Coughing would be so severe that patients would hurt their muscles. Not quite as bad as whooping cough, which will make you break bones, but muscle damage. Autopsies on these patients would show a lot of brain damage and lungs that were literally falling apart. We saw that some survivors would seem to have personality shifts. So we think that a lot of people who survived had brain damage. President Woodrow Wilson, president of the US during this time period, reportedly became more aggressive, stubborn, and argumentative. So that's an individual that people paid a lot of attention to. Did this have a role in the Allied forces winning because the survivors were more aggressive? Yeah, that's probably a bit much. But one of the things we see with World War I, as opposed to earlier wars, is that the losing side had harsher penalties and punishments for losing the war than we had seen in previous wars. So the winners made things really hard for the losers, and that probably contributed to the beginnings of World War II. So people were hurting, and when people are hurting for whatever reason, they lash out at others. That's the way humans are made. This second wave spread very quickly and widely, a lot of different places. When the second wave starts showing up in September, public health people said, okay, we need to do things like not have major public gatherings. And the city of Philadelphia listened to their public health people. Shortly after the first cases they recorded were on September 14th. And about 3 weeks later, they closed schools, they closed churches, they closed, hang on. Sorry, the city of Philadelphia did not ban the parade that they had scheduled. So they did close schools, theaters, and churches, but they still had this parade. And here is the mortality in Philadelphia. So here's the parade right here. You can see the line going up, starts going up at a sharper angle. We have much higher and much more sudden mortality. In St. Louis, they also had schools and theaters, churches, public gatherings, all of that closing. You can see they didn't have nearly the same death rate as Philadelphia did. 2 to 3 days after the parade in Philadelphia, flu cases were numbering in the thousands. And on one day in October, in Philadelphia, 759 people died from influenza. This is in a city that before this flu outbreak had an average death per week of only 485. So, and that was deaths from all causes. So the death rate more than doubled because of the flu. There was a third and final wave that happened over the winter and spring of 1919. And that was the last wave of the pandemic. And there were still more deaths, but the second wave was generally considered the most deadly. So let's talk about flu in general. In most years, flu fatalities in the US range from 20,000 to 50,000, which that's still a lot of people dying from one infectious disease that we make vaccinations for. Granted, the vaccines for flu generally are not as good as some of the other vaccines. Most of the people who die of flu in the US are elderly, very, very young, or have other health conditions, heart disease, diabetes, things like that. Flu is very, very contagious. You can spread the flu even if you don't have symptoms. We're seeing this with COVID as well. One of the interesting things about flu, and this is a flu virus here. It's obviously a cartoon diagram. There's some genetic material inside. There's a membrane here. But what I want to talk about on this image is these two proteins. Hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. These are antigens, so these are something that our immune system recognizes and attacks. So these are antigens, and these can have a lot of variability. So there are 16 known versions of hemagglutinin, and there are 9 versions of neuraminidase, which means there's a lot of different combinations here, which is one of the reasons we have to get a new flu vaccine every year. There's a new strain of flu, different hemagglutinins, different neuraminidase. So we often see these called things like H1N1. H1N1 means version 1 of hemagglutinin, version 1 of neuraminidase. When a new strain shows up with new hemagglutinin, new neuraminidase that hasn't been seen recently, people who have had the flu don't have immunity to the new strain. And as we're going to see, flu can make lots of changes to hemagglutinin and neuraminidase on the cell surface. So let's talk about how flu changes. So flu is an RNA virus. RNA viruses have very, very, very high mutation rates. We saw this with HIV, which is also an RNA virus. And there are a couple of things that can happen to change these hemagglutinin and neuraminidase protein combinations. One is antigenic drift. Antigenic drift is small changes. These can happen every time the virus replicates. We kind of saw this with HIV. This is just due to the way RNA viruses reproduce. Every time it reproduces, there are changes in its RNA, changes in its genetic code, and we can end up with slightly different strains. If the change is small and subtle, we will often recognize that flu strain again. But if the change is significant, the immune system won't have that memory. It won't recognize that virus, and it has to start over. Remember, we talked about how the naive immune response, the slower immune response, what we see when we haven't had a exposure before, it's not as strong. And it takes a while to get to that adaptive immunity, which is stronger, but it takes a while for it to build up. So you get too much antigenic drift, it's like you're seeing a new disease. Your immune system has to start over from the beginning. It's not going to have as strong of a response. You're more likely to get sick. Antigenic drift is a relatively slow process. Relatively, because remember, virus, they replicate very, very quickly. There's also antigenic shift. I know the words are similar, drift and shift. This is a much faster change. And it happens when we've got virus in waterfowl, like ducks, in pigs, and in humans. Ducks, pigs, and humans can all kind of swap virus, can swap the flu virus specifically. It doesn't always cause an infection. So right now there's a really nasty strain of avian flu, which affects all kinds of birds. It's really, really nasty. It can infect people, and it can cause a very nasty infection in people, but it's not capable of spreading from person to person. So what can happen is a pig can get an infection from the avian flu, and it gets an infection from human flu at the same time. And because it's got infection with these two different flus at the same time, you end up with a virus that is a hybrid between the one that's found in birds and the one that's found in people. This hybrid may or may not be able to cause infection, but if it can cause infection, this is a reassortant virus. It's a brand new combination of hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. It is much more likely to cause a nasty epidemic that year, or pandemic that year. So we can have some crossover, but this recombination is what really causes dramatic changes in the flu. And we tend to get these happening every couple of decades. And it tends to be high mortality years when these reassortment viruses are capable of infecting people. All right. Do you guys think you understand antigenic shift?
Yeah.
I think so.
Think so? Maybe. Okay. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna send you guys into breakout groups, and I want you to do two things for me. I want you to talk to each other about antigenic shift and see if you can help each other understand it a little better. And then I want you to see if you can figure out, in the 1918 flu, the first wave was pretty bad, but the second wave was more lethal. Based on what we've been talking about, see if you can figure out why that might have happened. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes to talk about that. Okay, guys, I'm getting ready to close the rooms. You have 1 minute to wrap up your conversations. Okay. So, do you think you understand antigenic shift now, or do I need to go over it again?
Still just like a little bit unclear.
Okay. I can go over that again. So let's do that first, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the second question. Let's see, I'm going to go to the whiteboard. All right, here's our flu virus. And it has some proteins on the surface. One of these is hemagglutinin, and one of these is neuraminidase. Now, if we also have a virus over here, and it's going to have some stuff on the surface. There's its version of, we'll call that neuraminidase, and its version of hemagglutinin. And so if we say that this one on the left is avian or bird related from a duck, and this one on the right is a human version. And what is going to happen here is these are, that's not a very good color. Are going to recombine in a pig, and what we will end up with is a different version. It's got different genes on the inside, and it has, let's say, this version of neuraminidase and this version of hemagglutinin. So it's got different combination of these surface proteins. It's got different information inside the RNA that determines how it infects and how much of a disease it causes and how severe of a disease it causes. Human immune systems recognize the human flu. This is the one that's been around for a while. It's not going to recognize the avian flu. So this flu, because it's got the avian neuraminidase protein, humans are not going to recognize it. This is a combination virus. It's a new virus that's never been seen before, and it's more likely to be able to infect humans or birds. So it could go either direction. Is that a little more clear?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay. So, why do you think the second wave of the 1918 strain of flu was deadlier than the first wave? Anybody come up with ideas?
Our group, we kind of thought that it was due to the fact that like the flu must have mutated in a sense. Like the first wave, it was really kind of like a wide global spread, and it spread really quickly. But then the second wave, it must have like almost centralized more, if that makes sense. And then like that was causing, yeah, it doesn't make a ton of sense, but like it started to become, the symptoms became worse, and then people started dying more. So
Okay. Certainly, pathogens can mutate and change over time. Absolutely. Anybody from the other group want to chime in with anything?
We were thinking that like probably just like from people not looking like, well, not like, well, okay, so they got out of like quarantine and then they weren't like taking care of themselves like that much, or they weren't worrying about it that much. And so it got to them that way. And also what the other group said, we were saying how like probably like maybe it changed from the first wave so that it was like stronger and stuff, and it just affected people like that.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely some of that involved. So let's go back to PowerPoint. So what I've got in my notes is that it's not uncommon for pandemics to change over time. Absolutely very common for this to happen. And it's not uncommon for them to come in waves. You see this with COVID. What generally happens is one person has a mutation that makes the disease spread quicker or become more lethal, and then it spreads out again from that infected individual. Pathogens commonly change how pathogenic they are, how severe they are over time. When we talk about the likelihood of the pathogenicity or the severity to change, the more people a disease passes through, the more likely we're going to see a change. So pathogenicity includes virulence, how severe it is, and spreadability. And it's more likely to change, as I said, the more people it goes through. So this can increase or decrease virulence. We've seen this with COVID. Some waves of COVID, like this past winter's wave, has been significantly milder than previous ones, but the Omicron wave was really nasty, worse than the first one. So it can go up, it can go down. In the 1918 flu, it moved through a lot of people worldwide, and it changed. And it doesn't, we have to also consider the fact that flu is a zoonotic disease. Which means that it can spread between humans and ducks and pigs and just move between these different species. And so it could have been that a pig on a farm got infected with the 1918 flu, got infected with an avian strain, and came up with a new one. So that could have had a role in it, but it was most likely just normal mutation and changing over time. fall of 1918 was the peak of the pandemic in the US, and it was really hitting military bases. That was where we were seeing the most infections and the most mortality. And as I mentioned before, up to 1 out of every 5 soldiers would be so sick they couldn't get out of bed. So the military said, we got to stop this. We got to do something about this. We've got to reduce the spread. So one of the things that they decided to do was initiate quarantine. Anybody arriving at a military base would be quarantined for 3 weeks in a separate area, so that if they had the flu, they couldn't spread it to the people who were already there. This was also when we start seeing routine use of masking in medical situations. It really wasn't done before this time period. So this is when we start seeing healthcare workers wearing masks. They also wanted to eliminate crowding, have more space between the beds. And they also did this thing where if you were laying in bed and your head was facing the wall, the soldiers to the left and right of you would have their feet facing the wall, so that there was a further distance between the face of soldiers in neighboring beds. They also did some stretching of curtains between beds, again, trying to reduce that spread. And of course, these rules were not applied equally. And the officers, especially the higher ranking officers, refused to quarantine. Well, viruses don't care. They do not respect that you're a general and you're important. They don't respect social status. They don't respect wealth, although the wealthy can usually get better medical care. So not surprisingly, that meant that the officers were bringing flu between military bases and spreading it among the troops and to each other. And I want to give you the story of Camp Grant. Camp Grant was in Illinois, and in August, Colonel Hagedorn took command, August 8th. At this point, the camp was already over capacity. They had more troops, more men there than they had space for them. So lots of them were living in tents, not in the buildings. In September, Hagedorn says, we're going to ignore the Army regulations on crowding. We can't have people sleeping in tents in the middle in Illinois. So he crowded everybody into the barracks. The medical staff says, yeah, Colonel, the flu is here and crowding is a problem and we're worried about it. Hagedorn ignored them. He did decide not to allow men to leave the base and go to the nearby towns. The idea being they couldn't go out and catch the flu from the community and bring it back. The flu arrived September 21st. A couple of men reported sick first thing in the morning. They were immediately isolated. By midnight on September 21st, 108 men were hospitalized. Their units were isolated, public gatherings were canceled. Within 4 days, 1,000 were hospitalized, and the deaths began. Within a week, there were not enough ambulances, not enough sheets, beds, and barracks were converted to sick buildings, to sick beds. So within a week of the first case, they were converting barracks to basically hospitals. This meant that all of the healthy were called on to deal with the sick. This could be everything from stuffing new mattresses with straw. So back then a mattress, yeah, they weren't like today. You made a big bag and stuffed it with straw. Unloading medical supplies and doing laundry, including the sheets that the flu infected troops were sleeping on. The first day that there were deaths at Camp Grant, 3,108 troops were transported in crowded train conditions to go to another camp. Civilian health officials were saying, we need to quarantine the camp. We shouldn't be moving people from this camp to other places. From this train, every time the train stopped for, fuel or food or whatever, troops were getting off the train. They were really jammed in there with a pretty severe overcrowding, and people on the train were already showing symptoms of the flu. Coughing, sneezing, bleeding out of their nose and ears, feverish. When the train arrived in Georgia, over 1/4 of the troops were rushed to a hospital. They were so sick that they were sent straight to the hospital. Eventually, over 2,000 of these troops got the flu, and an estimated 300 died. That means this train had a 10% mortality rate because the flu spread throughout. Back at Camp Grant, conditions were deteriorating. This was not the only place this was happening, but it's the one we're talking about as an example. It became hard to keep up with the paperwork. Paperwork? You've got all these men dying. Well, somebody has to notify families. Somebody has to issue death certificates. On October 8th, Hagedorn received the daily death notifications, and he issued a strange command. He ordered all personnel in the headquarters building to stand outside for inspection. They obeyed the order. Within half an hour, a single pistol shot was heard from headquarters. Hagedorn was just one more casualty of the 1918 pandemic. Okay. We're going to stop there, and then we're going to talk on Thursday about the end of the pandemic, the 1918 pandemic. Does anybody have any questions?
Nope.
Nope.
I don't
Okay.
think so.
Thank
All
you.
right.
All set.
I'll see you guys on Thursday then.
All right.
Thank you. Have a great
Thank
one.
you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.